Assalamu alaikum. There's a curious paradox at the heart of the Muslim community that seems to be affecting young Muslims, the rise of a quietist Islam. Well, it's not really Islam, at least that practiced by early Muslim generations, as it rips justice away from our concern and instead internalizes our efforts to just the personal. Some young Muslims on campus are oblivious to this activism taking place around them since the horrific genocide began, whilst others maybe rightly fear the excesses that are associated with the progressive movement that wants to remove believers sometimes from the conversation entirely. Now, universities are just about to begin, and to help us navigate this rather complex and at times vexing topic, I have convened my panel of young Muslims who, from time to time, will help me understand what is going on in their world, I suppose. So today we've got Layla, we've got Johear from the United States, and we've got Dr. Ayo, who've joined us on this Thinking Youth call. Assalamu alaikum all.
Walaikum salam. Good to see you.
Well, it's great to
What?
have you with us. Actually, it'd be wonderful just to get an idea of your background, the three of you. So, starting with you, Dr. Ayo, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, alhamdulillah. I am a psychiatry resident doctor. And then I was previously a student sabbatical officer, so fought against racism and Islamophobia as a full-time job when I was at UCL Students Union, and I was also one of the vice presidents of FOSIS's Student Affairs Committee, which is essentially their political affairs committee, deal with casework on Islamophobia again, and empowered students to take action and to secure their rights on campuses. So that's just a bit about me.
And Layla, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for having us on. My name's Layla. I am currently going into my second year of my PhD, where I'm looking at Islamophobia in higher education specifically. I am also a former sabbatical officer. Like Ayo, we crossed paths in 2019 and 2020, 2021, where I looked at kind of student experience and education matters for 28,000 students in a university in Liverpool. I, following that, sat on the national regulator, the Office for Students, student panel, where I kind of supported on advising on policies related to the student experience on a kind of national policy level as well, where I'm now doing my PhD and teaching alongside that as well at university.
Okay. And Johear, you're joining us from the United States. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair for having me. So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was involved with YM, Young Muslims, which is the largest Muslim youth organization here in the States. Attended the University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia, for college, where I was active in the Muslim Student Association. So I was president there my senior year. And now, as a graduate student here in Washington, D.C., I've been supporting various activism and grassroots efforts, particularly by engaging with college MSAs on a national level through chapter engagement and also the Palestine advocacy here.
Right. And as we go along, it'd be wonderful to get your perspectives on how activism is treated by the young Muslim community in the United States. Well, let's start with, I suppose, the problem I set out in my introduction, Dr. Ayo. And that's the problem of this quietism that seems to pervade a lot of our Muslim campus spaces, at least here in the UK. Just outline that problem for me, please.
So I think this is similar to what we talked about on the podcast with you actually, I think before. So, there are multiple layers, I think, towards, and I think it really depends on not just the Islamic society within that region or location, but also the Muslim population. What are their contexts and histories? The cultures and the backgrounds that are also coming from all influence these things. But I'd really start off with saying I think there isn't a sort of ideological influence there of the fact that Islam shouldn't be mixed with politics, or Islam should be devoid of politics, or anything which involves a Muslim taking action should only be done by those with enough knowledge and those in leadership, etc. And everybody else should go about their business and shouldn't be involved. some people would say, to be honest, that this is sort of Saudi imported, to be honest with you, this kind of mindset of, Muslims should just be docile and they should leave everything to those in rulership or leadership, and everybody else should keep their heads down and not be involved. And I think, to be honest with you, that perspective and mindset has really gone into our ISOCs. We saw in some encampments where the ISOC was nowhere to be seen, didn't even want to hold Jummah prayers at the encampment, didn't want to be involved with any of these things. Really damaging not to have the Muslim, ISOCs, Islamic societies, on campuses would say that they are the leadership of Muslim students. They represent Muslims, but they weren't doing that during the encampment. And when we've seen what's been happening in Palestine, Islam has been so central to the way that Gazans have been resisting and persisting, and to not have us mirroring that over here with our actions, our words from those in leadership, I think has been really, really disappointing. And I think as well, probably the second point, without going on for too long, that I'll sort of touch upon, is that I do feel like, again, there's this idea that politics is for lefties, and sort of it's not something that Muslims should be involved in, and it is something ideologically which is so far removed from us that we can't get involved. And if there are groups we disagree with, or don't 100% see eye to eye with, that we cannot be in those spaces. And so we begin to isolate ourselves so much, to the point that we are not involved in any conversations where we should be involved in. We don't help in setting any sort of political agendas. Even things like XYZ society, who we don't agree with and we don't share their politics, has signed on to this statement, for example. We can't sign on to that statement. Or they are partnered with the encampment, therefore we can't partner with the encampment. And it's sort of having to give a reality check of, we can't just remove ourselves from political spaces because there are people we don't like or don't agree with, or we don't politically align with, also in that sphere. The societies we live in, we don't live in full-on Muslim societies. These are mixed societies, and we have to understand how to relate to people, how to talk to people, sometimes even how to work with people, right, who we don't agree with, we don't politically align on. It doesn't mean we put our principles to the side. It doesn't mean that we, compromise in that sense, but it means that we take a mature approach where we have our red lines, we have our boundaries, but we engage constructively in a way which allows us to, advocate for Palestinians. That's what we're here to do, right? But this isolationist approach is just removing us from the conversation, to the point that, we're not doing anything, right? Maybe there's a few bake sales and cake sales going on, but that's not enough. We need more at this time. So,
Well, Layla, I would like you to comment on that, because I do see there are social activities or charity-based activities on Palestine. So you see a lot of bake sales on Palestine. You see a lot of charity work on Palestinian university campuses. But you don't actually see from Muslim or Islamic societies, at least in many of the universities. I know there are some exceptions, and it'd be wonderful to hear about those exceptions from you. But we don't really see the type of political activism, dare I say, even a radical form of political activism, that we may see from wider communities, from non-Muslim communities on campus. And I wonder, as a researcher in Islamophobia, I wonder how much that is based on a fear that envelops the Muslim community. This fear that if Muslims get involved with politics, they're somehow going to be maligned by the state. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, during the encampments in May, we asked that question a lot. Why are ISOCs and why are Muslim students not getting involved? And I think beneath all of that, subtly, I think everyone in this space will recognize, as a result of years of the kind of persistent surveillance and kind of counter-terror measures, like Prevent, which have silence students on campus gradually over years. And while students might not be able to name that, we can certainly see from their language when we ask them, why are you? They are worried about losing their prayer space, for example. They see themselves and their membership on campus as conditional, as we must perform our good, our inherently good Muslimness on campus in order to, get through. And they see that finish line on camp at the end of their degree as the be all and end all of their university experience, and they feel that if they get involved in any other activity, that might kind of have an impact on that. Them engaging in what is Islamic activism will impede on their kind of worldly, affairs and their worldly degree. And I think that is something that we need to, and that's something that we'll talk about later on. MSP came to kind of question, resolve, and nurture. But I think this whole thing of students not engaging in um, these encampments a few months ago, we heard things like, we're worried about losing our prayer space. The university are gonna do X, Y, Z, and we see that, unlike other groups on campus, Muslim students in particular are in fear of perhaps uh, the institution, the university taking away their degree, taking away their prayer space, taking away their inherent rights that every other student has. And it's that Muslimness that always is the trigger of that response.
Taking away their prayer space, I hear this a lot. If we get involved, the prayer rooms may be jeopardized, or they may take away our prayer rooms. I mean, have you come across that, and how do you deal with it?
I personally haven't. And it's always baffled me where and why students and where they got that from, really. But I think working as a student officer a few years ago, we know how hard it is, and students themselves know how difficult and how privileged they feel for having those kind of spaces. And so as a result, they kind of they hold on to them because they spent so much time grafting for them, and they feel that because they've developed that relationship, that that they'll lose it if that relationship is broken. And that is one of the problems, with the universities. Even if, for example, that's kind of in their head, we need to question why that's in their head. Why are universities not instilling that sense of belonging that they, that they do for other students, the other groups of students? And I think the fact that Muslim students do even have those ideas um, is quite damning as to the status quo of what being Muslim in education actually is now. It's be good, be that good immigrant. It's the good immigrant mentality, the good Muslim mentality that students have been conditioned to have.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, Johear, I would like to. I mean, you're from the United States, and in a way, the U.S. student population have pioneered the encampment movement and the protest movement on Palestine. And how engaged have the MSAs, I think you call the equivalent of our Islamic societies, how engaged are the MSAs, the Muslim student associations, in these encampments and activities on Palestine?
Yeah, sure. And I think comparing the U.S. sort of history in the last 8-10 months with the UK examples, incidents have been pretty shocking to me, because I feel like where we're coming from as an American context is very different. As soon as the campus activism surged, you could say, following the events in October 2023, Muslim organizations at the grassroots level, I feel, were generally well prepared to take the lead. Not necessarily the national organization, but definitely in the grassroots level, people were ready. And these organizations didn't emerge overnight, to be quite honest. They've been leading efforts regarding Palestine activism and other activism in general for over a decade at this point, and much more for some orgs. Their longstanding involvement, I believe, positioned them well as experienced leaders, especially when it came to collaborating with allies, many of whom are progressive or leftist, as mentioned earlier. I think a key point has been ensuring that both Muslim and Arab organizations, as those most directly impacted by the genocide in Gaza, set the direction, set the guidance, and the rules, to be quite honest, for how activism is conducted, given kind of the Muslim and Arab expertise on these issues, and in particular, the genocide. So, for example, when encampments were organized, I personally witnessed MSAs and other Muslim organizations and Students for Justice in Palestine establishing rules such as prohibiting alcohol, prohibiting marijuana at these encampments. And this wasn't done in isolation, but the progressive allies and leftist allies were cooperative and respectful of these boundaries, understanding that Muslims were leading the efforts. Another important measure to prevent, progressive or secular values from diluting the core message of ceasefire and a liberation for Palestine was a clear restriction on discussing issues that didn't align with Islamic values or Muslim values held by the majority of Muslim students, even though they may not have been the majority encampment people or organizers across some campuses, right? And this focus helped keep the narrative and the activism centered in general on Islamic principles, but also focusing on the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian cause. Looking back, also sort of looking at the American Muslim organizations on campuses and outside, we made it a priority to integrate Islamic practices into the activism. Basic things like 5 times Salah, Fajr, all the way to Isha, including in some campuses I saw Qiyam al-Layl happening almost every night. And after Maghrib and Isha, you had scholars and activists delivering khatira. So those scholars and Islamic scholars who are supposed to be the ones in some narratives, the only ones who can discuss politics, discussing politics to the whole crowd and offering their support for mobilizing for these issues. So we had Islamic scholars, we had activists who delivered khatiras and speeches and halaqat for not only Muslims who were praying, but also the non-Muslims who were at the encampments, right? And these efforts really reinforced the religious and spiritual dimension to the activism that I think sets us apart from some other parts of the world that were also engaging in similar activism. But I think one challenge that we recognize that I'm sure the UK is also considering is that just because an organizer is Muslim, if they are Muslim or if they are Arab or if they are Desi, it doesn't guarantee that they'll operate within that Islamic framework, right? So since October, larger Muslim organizations on campuses in particular have like strategically shifted, you could say, their focus to developing not only Muslims but Islamic workers, leaders who operate from a principled and nomadic perspective, you could say. And there are also other grassroots organizations that have been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, building Islamic workers and Islamic leaders who have successfully reframed the Palestinian issue and in America and especially on university campuses from being seen solely as a secular or humanitarian problem to one that is at its roots an Islamic issue that has an Islamic solution.
I mean, that's amazing, really. And when you describe the American scene, I mean, dare I say it, we typically in Britain, we tend to sort of downplay the Islamicness of American Muslims, and we see that all over social media. And probably that's a very, it's a very exaggeration. It's an exaggeration of type, but it seems like at least on the issue of Gaza, you guys have done much better than us. I mean, Ayo, Lila, what do you think about what you've just heard there?
So I think looking at some of the encampments I was involved in, I've had it reported to me quite frequently. I'm also looking at London encampments, also some in the Midlands and up north, where whenever the Islamic element was introduced, there was resistance from the lefties or people who are aligned with sort of left-wing politics. And it was said that the Islamic side is taking over things, or it's becoming too religious. And this was a criticism that was leveled at Muslims. These were not necessarily Muslims who were even associated with the Islamic societies, but Muslims who were trying to center the Islamic practice and Islamic side of things within the encampments. And I think the precedent for doing that and the justification for doing that was there, because when we looked at in Gaza, when we see so many Palestinians being bombed and their families being killed, we've seen it so many times. Hasbiyallah and Nimr killed. This is something we see that they say, right? Faith, Islam is such a big part of it. And to be honest, there was really a feeling that actually some of these lefties, depending on what ideologies or what beliefs or groups they're part of, communism or whatever it may be, it was actually felt that by a lot of Muslims I spoke to, that they were actually trying to center their causes and de-center away from Palestinian lives, in that sense, in that Palestinian lives were not being centered and the Palestinian cause itself was not being centered. And there were even Palestinians themselves who came and said that at the end of the day, like, all Palestinians are being bombed, no matter what sexual orientation they are, no matter what they believe in, no matter what group they're part of, no matter whether they're practicing Muslim or not, whether they're Muslim or not, right? They're being these are the people being bombed. So when you bring in all of your causes into this, it skews away from what we're actually trying to work for. And obviously, these were some tough conversations that were had But at the end of the day, I think it's important that when we are working on behalf of a set of people, especially when we're looking at what's happening in Gaza, like I said, Islam is a center point, and we need to respond to that, reflect that, mirror that, amplify that message. The fact that Islam has been a central part of them resisting and persisting. So in our activism here, in the West or in the UK or in the US, that should be mirrored. We should be having, how many janaza prayers have we seen over mass graves, for example? So many shrouded dead bodies, right? This has been a central part of the images that we've been viewing, right? So we need to mirror that. This is not the time to center X, Y, and Z. It's time to center Palestinians and the way, and to mirror what they are doing and how they are persisting through this genocide. So,
I mean, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, Lila, please.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I definitely echo what I was talking about there. However, I think students who did try to embody, as he said, those Islamic principles and that ethos in their encampments were often shunned away by those exact, some of the lefty groups. I've heard of stories where Muslims were kicked out because they didn't want to partake in certain activities, where, there was almost, again, that conditional membership where they have, or the majority, if the group was majority lefty, they had that power whenever they wanted to do that switch to kick out the Muslim when they want it, when they were too Muslim. And I think there's a hypocrisy often within the groups that supposedly say they ally with the Palestinians, is that they can't accept the Islamic faith. So whilst I think anecdotally from what I hear that America's quite conservative still in their beliefs. They don't have as many lefties as we probably do in the UK. And I think that might be why that was the case, why, they were allowed to do that. I mean, even some of the encampments which were Muslim dominated, which I was like, wow, they're really shining. When I spoke to some of them at the conference, I found out that actually they had a really, the ones that we put on as a, uh, example for us, they themselves told me stories about how difficult it was for them to maintain that.
Well, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, so there is an intolerance maybe in the sort of progressive left towards Islamic practice. Johear, I mean, it seems like in your experience in the United States was somewhat different. I mean, did that require a level of conversation before you got there, or is it are we just dealing with a different type of activism in the US?
Yeah, I think looking at the larger political context, and just to piggyback off the point on America being more conservative, we look at the two-party system here in America. Both parties are pretty conservative, kind of objectively, right? And not only that, but you compare 2020 elections to 2024 elections, the Democratic Party, which is the progressive party in within our context of America, has moved more right, in my opinion, more conservative, in my opinion, since the last 4 years. For example, even leaving the genocide aside, more strict about criminal justice reforms, very pro police, very pro gun. Kamala Harris talked about her owning a gun in the last presidential debates, right? So overall, the American political arena is not as accommodating for leftist or liberal talking points and a leftist or liberal movement. Whereas in the United Kingdom, you guys have socialist leaning and leftist leaning political parties who have autonomy and have a space to occupy both on a local and at least somewhat of a national level, right? So I think understanding that political arena makes it fortunately a lot easier for us to keep those Islamic values and more, in their terminology, conservative values present and more, public. On top of that, regarding the conversations, right? I think both Muslims and leftists are trying to generate their own political power, which isn't necessarily the case for the UK, where the socialists and leftists do have a lot more relevance and prevalence in your guys' community. So knowing that the conversations we had, it would definitely require to make sure that we are setting things straight, as I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, it is strategic for Muslims. We know that we're trying to garner our support, not only dawah and getting more people to become Muslims, but also actually see tangible change for the issue that we're trying to strive here for, which is centering Palestine and Gaza. And similarly for the leftist and socialist movements, it makes sense strategically to work with Muslims because they're similarly trying to garner their support and make a name for themselves. So understanding the context here in America, I think, is important and leads to why outcomes we're seeing, the accommodation we're seeing, the coalitions we're seeing are actually taking place and developing since October.
I came across a discussion today, and it was a conversation with someone who's relaying one of the Muslim groups who are active on campus and their thoughts about the encampment movement. And it wasn't particularly charitable. They were suggesting that the encampment movement was infantile, and it didn't procure very many results, and it's better to have individual conversations with the university authorities rather than to camp out outside and to and sort of downplaying, I suppose, what they saw to be progressive tactics. Muslims shouldn't emulate those progressive tactics. I mean, Ayo, have you come across that? You know, this idea that the Muslim way of doing things isn't to demonstrate; it's to have conversations.
Yeah, I have found this, and sometimes, to be honest with you, it comes with a bit of a patronizing, condescending sort of tone with it. Actually, to be honest with you, in that there are people, Muslims in our community who believe seat at the table, or donating to charity or using money in a philanthropic way will get us the results that we need. And I think, you know, in the way that they criticize, for example, the Muslims who are part of the encampment, right, for their approaches, actually, some of the approaches that they have taken on in the way they're criticizing is sometimes quite capitalist approaches, sometimes quite neoliberal in their approaches. So I think they also need to look at themselves in terms of what is influencing them to come with the approaches that they're coming with. But to come back to the point, I think that at the end of the day, I've spoken to my scholars and sheikhs, and they've said encampments are, they're fine to do. Protesting is fine to do. Of course, you pray your salah, you don't do things which a Muslim shouldn't be doing, in that sense. But we do have our boundaries, that we have as Muslims. But something like an encampment is actually really important, and the people who have a seat at the table. When I was a sabbatical officer, I often ended up occupying two of these different positions where I was an agitator from the outside leading protests. But then because I was formally elected with an institution, I had to sit at the table as well and speak to those people who I was agitating and protesting against. And actually, when you're on the two different sides, you begin to really see that the people who have this seat at the table that they have so coveted often are able to push through their demands, their requests, whatever you want to call them, because of the people agitating outside. And often, actually, I've spoken to some of these people who have their seat at the table, or even been part of those meetings at times, right? They utilize the tactics and the agitation of the people on the outside, sometimes as a soft power sort of threat of, look, we've got these people outside doing X, Y, and Z. We really need to get this through. And actually, on some campuses, the senior management team were having meetings into the early hours of the morning, right? Trying to decide, what should we do about these students? These are human beings, right? Who are in senior management teams, right? They get nervous, they get fearful like everybody else, right? And it had a big effect on them, right? To the point that they were taking legal actions to evict these students from the camps. So if they're taking such actions and, getting so worried about what these students are doing, obviously it's making a difference, right? We've seen divestments happening because universities have held their hands up and said, look, we don't want any more of this. We've seen legal actions. We've seen negotiations happening. And I think last thing I'll say is that the people who push for having this seat at the table so much need to be very, very careful that, I'm not saying everybody who takes that the line of action is arrogant or naive, but that can definitely come into play into the motivations, that arrogance and naivety doesn't allow them to be used as a tool against our communities. What we actually saw happening was that there were some ISOCs, unfortunately, who were naive or they didn't get advice, and the universities saw them as individuals who could be pliable and malleable, to the university's agendas, and would say, we're not going to talk to the Palestine Society, but we'll talk to you. You guys are the good guys, they're the bad guys, creating those divisions, right? And then using, the people who have that seat at the table against the people on the outside. So if you are going to have a seat at the table, right, if that's something that, if that is what you're going for, this is not a strategy that can be used in isolation. Otherwise, you'll be used against the people on the outside who are doing the important work.
Great. Leila, I know that you've been quite heavily involved with the Muslim Students for Palestine organization or network that was set up earlier this year I suppose, as a response to the lack of action on campus. Just give us an appraisal of how far that's come. And I understand that you and Ayo were involved. You were leading workshops at the weekend's conference, which I attended. And mashallah, it was really well attended and very well organized. Jazakallah khair. Tell us a little bit about why this organized work is so important.
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, in May we set up Muslim Students of Palestine. I think its whole mission was about one, connecting Muslim students with one another across the UK, those who were involved in encampments, helping them with the challenges that they were facing and the barriers and all of those issues which we've just been talking about, but also to kind of nourish and nurture and build that Islamic activism within those who weren't active. And so, we have been in touch with a number of ISOCs. We've got, a brilliant team who are leading on that campaign, and organizations such as CAGE, ELSC, and so on, who have supported that action. Ultimately, to a point where we got to the conference over the weekend. And within that conference, again, all of those coalition groups, ASAP, the Association for Student Activism on Palestine, kind of organized that event and co-led that event. And, students from all around the country came down to London, and they heard from speakers such as Rabbani from CAGE, Dr. Rana Baker from KCL, who almost fulfilled and filled that gap, that vacuum that a lot of students had been missing. There was one student I spoke to, actually, who was from Liverpool, who said to me, I came with no expectations. I didn't really know, I was just happened to be actually in Leicester. And he said to me, I had no expectations, but wow, I'm blown away. Everything was relevant. It was so practical. Some of the workshops that we covered looked at, Know Your Rights. So Ayo and I delivered, a carousel of those. We had, Shema Delali, former NUS president, talking about campaigning 101, and that was just the basics. Who are the university? What is their, what are their kind of, who are the stakeholders that you should be interested in interacting with? You had things around, what was it? Zionism, and talking about the tackling the Zionist kind of narrative on campus, and supporting students in their articulation of the Palestine cause within their institution. And ultimately, it was such a wholesome experience, but also quite an eye-opening experience. Definitely took away a lot of things, at least quite selfishly within my PhD, where I heard things like, Ayo and I heard that one university had compared some action that students had on campus to the London bombings. And that whole, again, intersection of, the counter-extremism, counter-terror apparatus with the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which almost criminalizes, albeit non-legally binding, that action on campus. It makes students unable to vocalize that. And we see that, has been enabled by even the student union, the National Student Union, with Shema Delali. And so we're seeing quite a fallout, and we heard the fallout of that within the students who attended. And I think the amount of students who came telling us, our university is disciplining us, they're investigating us, what can we do? Can I share this letter even though it says it's confidential? All of these dilemmas that students are facing, that they had nowhere to go. And it spoke to the need for that campaign for Muslim Students for Palestine to exist. I don't know if Ayo, you had any other reflections.
No, I think I'll just concur, to be honest, echo just quickly. I think, you need those kind of conferences, I think, and those gatherings. I'm not sure, Johear, it'd be good to hear if anything like that's happening in the US, but especially the hardship and the sort of burnout a lot of students have gone through disciplinary actions being enacted upon them. There were some encampments that went on for over 100 days, or some 50, 60, 70, 80 days. That takes a lot of mental, physical, emotional, spiritual fortitude actually to do that, to stick out there. Sometimes it was raining, sometimes it was cold, sometimes perhaps maybe they didn't get the numbers they wanted at certain actions, for example. And to keep that resilience and to keep persisting through that, I think, it took a lot of energy from the students. So I think things like conferences actually are really helpful in rebuilding up that energy, building connections, being around like-minded people who have also been through similar experiences, and also those who are trying to learn, and also those who are maybe more advanced on that sort of activism journey. But knowing that you're not alone, you're all in tandem together. It was quite eye-opening for me, I think, just to see people just coming into uni or in their first and second year. I felt quite old actually when I told them how long ago I'd been a sabbatical officer when I came to uni. But it actually shows you that there are new generations, there are new people coming through the ranks who are doing the work. So it was nice to see for us as well, as people have been in the student space for a bit.
And what was really pleasant to see, I mean, I think you've all come across naysayers within our community who suggest that activism within the Muslim base, young Muslim base, is now disappeared. We don't have that anymore. Most Muslims just want to keep their heads down and be involved in the spiritual or the charitable aspects of ISOC, but do not really want to get involved. It seems like there is a thirst, a real enthusiasm to work for Islamic justice, to work for justice on campus. And I mean, that was really, really wonderful to see that so many people were willing to come to a conference on this issue. How do we keep that momentum, Johear? Lots of young Muslims, your campus, your universities are beginning very soon, I believe, as well, if they've not begun already. This is Freshers Week in the UK, and next week as well, many universities begin. How do we capture that enthusiasm and maintain that enthusiasm going forward?
Yeah, that's to mention a point that was brought up earlier. I don't know where this idea comes from, but the demands and meeting with administration is not divorced from encampments, right? So encampments were just the start of the activism that started, end of last semester, but that has, moved along a lot since then. University administration have had to capitulate to activism and advocacy organizations ranging from Muslim orgs and Arab orgs collectively, and also some leftist organizations, to meet with these organizers to talk about what are the actual demands we're trying to meet. Ranging from full-on divestment from Zionist entity assets, all the way to more simpler things like allowing for a little more freedom of activism and freedom of speech on campuses that may have not been the case prior to all this, or at least putting Muslim organizations on the same playing field as their other religious counterparts. So I think the momentum, how to keep it going, is exactly what's already happening in America and some universities. Continuing the momentum and sort of the pressure that the encampments were bringing, and bringing it to kind of the table with a principled mindset. Of course, having a seat at the table is not the end all be all, but at least the ones who are organizing on the ground, I believe, are a lot more conscious of, the nuances that come with being at the table, and are a lot more principled in that manner as well. So I think definitely, if the end goal, which is the case for a lot of encampments, is to divest from all these unethical industries and from Zionist entity assets, then leveraging the encampments for meeting with administration is the clear next step, and is the case for a lot of university administration. What I will mention though, and I think there is definitely maybe some opportunities for more global activism, for the more global coalition building, but I'm not sure if that's something we want to go
Yeah,
into
let's
as
talk about that. I mean, I think that's wonderful because we can be quite detached, ISOC by ISOC or MSA by MSA, but also country by country. So how do we leverage those connections that we can make with Muslim students around the world, Johear?
Yeah, I think, there definitely, on the American side at least, there's definitely a clear need for a more global network um, of activists, of people who are on the ground, of scholars, of leadership. Because first and foremost, the Muslim American political space is far from perfect. So the first thing is we can definitely benefit from the British Muslim experience or the French Muslim experience or the German Muslim experience, etc. I think within America, one of the major issues stem from the lack of effective communication between organizations. So in the UK case, ISOC to ISOC, within the American case, the MSA to MSA, even within the same region or the same state or even the same city, because we have some cities with like 5 or 10 MSAs. So when compared to other religious groups that have a strong top-down and also bottom-up organizational structure, Muslim organizations in general, not just campuses, fall short. I think regional and national connections are crucial because, firstly, that allows us to amplify collective voice instead of diluting it. Secondly, like strategically mobilize around common causes, and thirdly, provide Islamic orgs an opportunity to instill their vision, mindset, and a worldview when working with more secular or liberal organizations. And I think on the point about conferences, we have legacy organizations, the homegrown organizations that have been in the US since the 60s or 70s that have built a large coalition. The big one is called US Council of Muslim Organizations, which has done a pretty commendable job connecting Muslim orgs at the top. So this past weekend, where there was something called the USCMO the Youth Conference in Chicago that put a lot of the leadership of your large organizations together. The ones that are principled, the ones that are Islamic, covering a lot of demographics. You had Muslim organization that typically represent the Bangladeshi American community, Muslim organization that cover the youth of Pakistani Americans. We had there was even the presence of a strong presence of the inheritors of the African American Dawah movements from the 60s and 70s post civil rights, and who were all in the same room together, the same conference, talking and discussing what are the next steps for the Muslim American community at large and how do we collaborate together in a meaningful way. So, we give credit to our elders for the work they've accomplished in building out these connections at the top. But it's now, I believe, on us, at least in America, to take this coalition to the next level and make them more effective. And I think looking at it globally, I believe that the same value propositions that exist at a national level in America regarding having a collective voice and mobilizing, that these value propositions um, in America can be scaled up globally. So especially in Western nations where Muslim organizations are often led by first or second or third generation immigrants from countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh or Egypt or Palestine, so on and so forth. And while counter-terrorism efforts in the UK and USA, I think, attempt to link these, Western Muslim orgs with movements in the Muslim world from the 20th century in particular, I think our challenges in America and our solutions are a lot more aligned between Muslim communities in the West than between Western Muslim orgs than any other movement in the Muslim world. A lot more connections between the West to the other parts of the West than looking back at the Muslim world. So, for example, and we'll end off with this, for example, like, due to the nature of like the nation state and Western institutions and the lack of neutrality that secularism really offers, no matter how religious, political, or active a Muslim organization is on campus, the universities don't need a justification to shut down Muslims organizing. And this happened here in America. This has happened on some campuses where even MSAs that were not heavily actually involved in activism now need special permission to have or hold Jummah. So if the situation is so dire that regardless of how little you do on campus, you're still a target of university administration, the only logical next step for all Muslims on campuses is to resist and persist as a collective and principled movement. And at this point, and this is the point I was mentioned earlier, centering on accommodation with administration and remaining apolitical just to preserve our prayer spaces, quote unquote, is no longer, in my opinion, a viable strategy because merely having a seat on the table is not enough, right? So Muslims across the West are developing an understanding that the issues in the Muslim world, whether it's Palestine or Sudan, is an issue for Muslims abroad. And at the same time, Muslims in America feel the impact of Islamophobia in France and in the UK and vice versa. So given like the similar political infrastructure built across the West, we need to really open up dialogue and align on strategy. And what has worked in America can work in the UK and vice versa. So I think we need to really collectively find solutions with the support of our shuyukh who possess, the religious acumen alongside, political organizers and grassroots organizers and activists who can provide the political insight to create some sort of strategy and mindset that benefits, I think, all of us collectively.
Ayo, you were nodding away, then I think it's a fantastic proposition that our brother Johear raises for establishing a global network. I mean, maybe it's a good idea for me to facilitate that, at least through my channel, but I think it's
Mm.
well worth exploring.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I actually just finished reading Malcolm X's autobiography as my third time. I actually listened to it about audio recording this time, audiobook, and I think I was really able to get certain meanings more than I had from reading actually a lot the last times. And I think, Gia, something you said really stuck with me in that, in terms of building global networks, it's so important. When we look at Malcolm X's life, especially after he went on the Hajj pilgrimage. He went to Algeria, he went to Nigeria, he went to Ghana. He met with different ambassadors from different parts of the world, and was meeting with a lot of different people, and those people often were Africans, Black Africans as well, but also just people from all around the world, in order to understand how their own people had been oppressed, so he could go back and help African Americans, right, to understand deeper the oppression that African Americans were going through. And I think, sometimes in the UK, I do think that, the Muslims were, this is even above the sort of Islamic society level, but even at our organizing groups and our Muslim leadership orgs, or so-called representative organizations, they often stay in a very sort of ethnocentric cultural bubble, and this is usually Asian from my experience. They don't take the time to see and understand the different perspectives, different groups within our communities that all comprise the identity and the label of Muslim, right? And I think if we're going to make cohesive and comprehensive strategies, we really need to do this. And this means not just speaking to people in our UK communities, but like, Gia said, forming these global networks. And I think, from reading Malcolm X's autobiography, seeing the insights and the way his thoughts changed through the book because of the interactions that he had, the transformation, it helped facilitate the transformation that he went through. Even, for example, he reduced his usage of the word Negro, right, and moved to Afro-American, right? Because when he went to West Africa, they told him, we don't use the word Negro here, right? Even these understandings and shifting of language, shifting of praxis and frameworks, you have to expand, right? And we need to be creative. Like, I think some of the stuff that's going on in the US, we could learn from them, and they could learn from us. And Jay, I really agree with you. I think that we are in a different time and a different place, and I think there is a lot more to be learned, I believe, from other Western Muslim contexts actually than the Muslim world, the wider Muslim, non-Western Muslim world at the moment, and their political context. And even looking historically at the Western Muslim context, for example, in the UK and the US, there's so much rich history. I've also been connecting with, some elders who are active in different organizations, active on the ground and the grassroots. They're not on social media, they're not in these places, but they have a lot of knowledge that we can actually gather and take from. They have a lot of understanding and experiences of events that have also gone, and we need to really draw upon those actually. So I really do agree with Jay, what you've been saying.
Yeah,
Oh,
and just
fantastic.
to add a really
Yes,
quick
Johear.
point, I think regarding like institutional knowledge, one thing that we have struggled with a lot, and this is more so in particular to like the South Asian context, is that as much as we want to think we are at the forefront of the Islamic and the Muslim community in America, we were not the first here effectively. The first communities that were built out in America among the Muslims were the African American Muslim community that was also at the forefront of dawah and at the forefront of political building and coalition building. And I think one thing we struggle with to this day in America, as big large Muslim orgs, is that we want to go to like these more quote unquote diverse communities and be like, oh, this is what we're doing. How about we get you involved in this? Which is, at surface level, a pretty good way to get involved with them. But at the end of the day, they've been here longer than we have. And not only that, why would they want to work with us if we haven't shown any interest or any, enthusiasm to learn about who they are? What are they doing to serve their community? How can we get involved to serve their communities, right? So I think quite practically, whether it's on a global level or a local level, we have to approach a lot of these conversations from a serving mentality, right? We want to go help let's say, for the sake of the conversation and for the argument, let's say I am as a South Asian, and let's say I'm a part of like a predominantly South Asia organization. If I want to involve the African American Muslim community, I wouldn't go to them and be like, "Oh, this is our program, come do it." It'd have to be the opposite. We have to go to them first, to their programs, their events, and show at least some enthusiasm and motivation to serve their community and be and kind of support them without any return expected, right? I think that is how you open up doors because, quite honestly, that hasn't been the case in the last 50 years in the American Muslim context. And I think we're just realizing this that although it's quite apparent in the seerah that, Prophet ﷺ was a servant leader at first, right? At first and foremost, we haven't been able to recreate that in any capacity. I think we're just realizing that is the viable and the only logical next step to unite Muslims within the American context. So based on that, I'm sure there's a lot of things we can extrapolate from that for the more global context if we're talking about uniting and working together as a coalition, as a larger movement.
If I may come in there, throw a spanner in the works. I think, to be honest, before we look at any global, I guess, connection, whilst I'd always advocate for such, we seriously need to look at the national, fixing the national within our own communities and with our own context. So I don't know what it's like in America, but I think there's a huge challenge nationally for Muslim students in the UK and how they kind of are represented, how they are I guess, supported. And we see, for example, in comparison to, I guess, the Jewish equivalent, which is heavily dominated by that Zionist narrative, the Union of Jewish Students, and how they have nationally mobilized to achieve their aims. Meeting with the Prime Minister earlier in July. Where are the Muslim equivalents? We need to first of all establish, and are we trying to walk? We're trying to run before we can walk here, is all I'm thinking. I certainly agree there's a need for a global, unified response, but I think there's problems or challenges that we need to resolve on the lower.
And in many ways, I think that's what Muslim Students for Palestine is trying to mend. You guys are developing strategies to capture those Muslim students, who are many on campus, who want to engage in political activism with a firm grounding in their faith. I mean, from your side, Ayo and Leila, and we'll have to end it very soon. Do you feel that there is an appetite to organize the Muslim campus better today than there was, say, 1, 2, 3 years back? Ayo first, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Inshallah. And then you can go ahead. So I would definitely say, from my time when I was vice president. So first is the Islamic Society representative body for Islamic societies across the country. So I would say that, it always felt like it had to chase ISOCs down, to give them trainings that would be helpful to them, to give them proactive help, whether it be on prevent or Islamophobia. I felt like they would, say that's not on their priority list, that's not something they need, or that it's not something they need now. And then when an issue would come up later on down the line with prayer spaces, one of the biggest targets I found was that prayer spaces were always something that ISOCs would be in fear of losing, but also universities would threaten them with losing it as well, to be honest with you. And I dealt with a lot of cases around that. And so it felt like we were always being reactive. The proactive means were offered often, and it was often rejected. This is not in our priorities. We don't think this would happen to us, or we don't need it now. We don't think it's an issue. And then later on down the line, something happens and we're being reactive, fighting fires, crisis management, But actually, when I went to the conference, there were some, ISOCs there who admitted, their presidents or their committees, and I've had talked to some of them online, admitted that we need to do more. We're not doing enough, and we do need to shift. Those are the ISOCs I feel who are receptive. they are willing to learn, or their committees, at least at this time, and their leadership at this time is willing to learn. But inevitably, you have the more stubborn ones who are not going to budge, and they think what we're talking about here is nonsense and it's not relevant. And I think something we also kind of later, just sort of coming off of what you said, is I think often our responses in the UK can be quite London centric. Layla has been up in Liverpool and was at the center of some of the riots, and the Islamophobic and racist riots we saw. Those kind of individuals, the far right, and even some of them may not even necessarily come under the banner of far right in that sense. And these people, these Islamophobes, these racists, they were attacking the smaller Muslim communities in these smaller towns. And I often feel like we're so set on London, what's happening in London, that we forget that even up north. I remember when I was in Foses, there were Muslim communities. I'd never met a Scottish Muslim before. I remember when I first met a Muslim with a Scottish accent, I did a double take. You don't conceive of such things. I just didn't know, because my mindset was so London centric. But I think there's two things in here, that I do think there are people becoming more active, but I think as well, for those of us who are leading on this engagement, we do need to look and broaden our scope further than London or Birmingham or Manchester, the sort of big cities. We need to look at the smaller ISOC, smaller Muslim communities as well, where they're actually on the front lines in a lot of the cases. So, yeah.
Look, Jazakallah khair. Layla, did you want to finish off there?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes and no. I'd say the problem with the Muslim community, as any other community really, is that the kind of appetite for activism comes in waves. And whenever something kind of, at this time it's Palestine, in 2021 again, it was Gaza. Every single time something happens, there's a wave of people getting involved and then they drop off. And we need to look at something more sustainable. But in making that comment, I'd also say that actually students today are not very political. They're not. There's we see the problem with Muslims, yes, but actually it's quite proportionate to the wider kind of student space. I find that a lot of students, they don't vote when it comes to the student elections. They don't get what NUS does. They don't get the student political structures as it is. And I think that whilst there are those challenges that the Muslim community we need to resolve, I think as a result of ultimately capitalism, everyone's on the go. No one has time to involve themselves in these extra matters on campus, which inevitably they should in order to resolve their burnout, the cost of living crisis, and all of the things that students are going through right now. And I think getting involved in politics students see as a luxury sometimes that they can't afford to put time into, which is so sad to see. So I think ultimately, yes, I would say there is, over the past year we've seen a greater, I think students have awoken or been awakened, yes, to that, to knowing that they need to do more. But because haven't previously, it's too late. It comes too little too late. And I think perhaps now is the time to have that conversation around how do we maintain momentum? How do we, keep it sustainable until the next thing happens, because something will happen. If it's not Gaza, if it's not Palestine, it'll be something else. So yeah, we need to learn our lessons as we go.
Jazakallah khair. It's really been a fascinating conversation with the three of you, and really I've found a lot of food for thought there, and it's inshallah I feel that we're on the cusp of something quite big, inshallah, in the student movement around the world, and you guys are doing fantastic work. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Johear, I'm planning to come visit you very soon in the United States, inshallah, and I plan to see some of you and some of your MSAs on campus, inshallah ta'ala, and that would be nice. And thank you very much, Jazakallah khair. And I feel that these conversations are really necessary, and we plan to host more of them as we go along, as the issues arrive. But thank you very much for today. Jazakallah khair, Johear, Lila, and Ayo. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.